Hi guys, welcome back to the channel. I'm Craig and I'm a software developer in the UK, and in this video we're going to take a look at HTML attributes with a particular focus on links and images. We'll look at the href attribute, which allows us to specify and use different types of links. Links that navigate to external sites, to different pages within our own site, or just to different parts or sections of the same page. We'll also look at the image elements source attribute, which allows us to include images on our page from anywhere on the web, or preferably to images that we control locally. Images also have an alt attribute which provide alternative text if an image cannot load, and this is used by screen reader software so that the visually impaired can still understand the image. We'll also learn how we make images themselves into links, and if you watch right to the end of the video I'll give you some bonus JavaScript. If you like the content on the channel, please remember to smash that like button, to subscribe and comment, as it really helps with YouTube's algorithm. Okay, so that being said, let's get started. In the last video, we looked at lists in HTML, and we saw that ordered lists can have attributes like type to determine whether the list is numerical or alphabetical. We can also have a start attribute, which determines the value from which the list starts at. We also saw a reversed attribute, which reverses the list to start from a higher value that decreases. We can use attributes with all HTML elements, and these come in many different forms and serve many different purposes. Attributes tell us more about elements and are a way of adding additional information, and are always specified in the opening tag of the element that they are added to. Attributes always come in key value pairs. So we have a key or a name and some quotation marks into which we give the attribute a value. A good place to start exploring this further is at MDN. They have a great attribute reference with all of the attributes that are used in HTML. So scrolling down, we can see here that there are a huge number of different attributes, and of course you don't have to use or know all of these, and you'll find that you might only regularly use 10 or 15 of these attributes. Which ones these are will become fairly apparent quite quickly. And we should note that you cannot use every attribute listed here with each single HTML element. Most attributes will work on one or two elements, and which elements particular attributes work with are indicated here in this middle column. So for example, the height or width attributes would be used to change the size of an image or a video, among other things. So just keep in mind that there are a huge number of attributes for us to make use of, but much like with HTML elements, we don't need to remember all of them. And we will find as we go along, we will have a handful that we'll fall back on and use regularly. So if we head over to our text editor, we'll look at links first, and we all know what links are. Links are actually one of the key innovations that hold the World Wide Web together. Without links, there's no connectivity. Links are found in all web pages and are what enable us to be able to traverse the World Wide Web. To add links, we use A or anchor tags, and A tags generally have just one or two attributes. The first and most important attribute that we use with A tags is the href, which means the hyperlink reference. The href attribute specifies the URL of the page the link goes to when clicked. So if we want to link to Google, we would add the URL of http://www.google.com as our hyperlink reference. We must remember to include the HTTP at the beginning of the URL as well, and I'll explain why in just a second. The last thing is, though we've added our HTML markup, we need to have some clickable content, something that we will click on our web page. Our A tags are going to surround some content, and at the moment I'll add the text of link to Google. But this doesn't have to be text, and it could quite easily be an image if we wanted it to be, and we'll look at how we do this in just a couple of minutes. So if we click on that link now, we see that we do have a working hyperlink that does indeed take us to our intended destination. The HTTP we added at the start of our URL, as I said, stands for Hypertext Transfer Protocol. HTTP is the protocol or system that is used by the World Wide Web, which defines how data is communicated and transmitted. So for example, when you enter a URL in your browser, this actually sends an HTTP request to a web server, instructing it to fetch and send the requested page to you. If we exclude the HTTP protocol, the browser will think that you are using something called the file protocol as opposed to the HTTP protocol. This will essentially mean that the browser will look for whatever you're trying to link to within your own local files. So you need to make sure that your link is specified with HTTP so the browser knows to look out into the web of the file. We'll put the protocol back in and we see that the link is now working just fine. Another thing that we can do in the href is that we can add a hash symbol or an octothorpe, and the hash symbol will keep the link active on the page, but it will be what we'd call a dead link. You can use this as a placeholder when building your links out if you don't know or do not have to hand the locations where you're going to be linking to. Another really cool attribute that we can give our links, give our anchor tags, is called the target attribute. And we can see a little more about this attribute if we go back to MDN. We'll look at the page for the anchor element. The link is in the description for you guys. If I scroll down, we can see the info for the targets attribute. And we see that the default is the target self value, which means that the tab that we're in the browser is where our link will open. We also have this target blank, and blank is what allows us to open the link in a new tab, which is handy if you want to keep the current tab open. Next, we'll take a look at the clickable content of our links, and it isn't a requirement that this always has to be text. This could be images instead, for example. So first we need to have a look at images and their attributes, and then we'll get our images working as links. We have the option to either use images that we have within our own project's file structure, or we can link to an image that is somewhere else online. We'll start by looking at the latter of these two options and link to an image that we find online. The img element represents an image, and this is an element that does not need a closing tag as it isn't going to surround any text or other content. So we would call this an empty element. Images use attributes, and the main attribute of the img element is the src, which is the source location of the image. The value we give the src is the location from which the browser needs to get the image. And again, to reiterate, this could be within the project's file structure or from an external location such as from another website. One such website that's a really good resource to get photos from is unsplash.com, and we see that it says here, beautiful free photos gifted by the world's most generous community of photographers. So if we go back to VS Code and we write out an image tag, we can see that it will look something like this. So we will have two angled brackets, then img to name the element, and then we have the src attribute. Next, we're going to need an image to source to put into our src attribute, and we'll find one externally on the web. I could use Unsplash, but for now I want to actually find the Google logo. So I'm going to go to Wikipedia and go to their entry for Google. We'll see the Google logo over on the right, and this is going to be absolutely perfect for our purposes. So if we right click that image, we can select copy image address and return to our text editor and paste this in as the value of the src attributes. It is preferable though to have our images stored in a location that's controlled by us. So for example, within the project's file structure. If you do not have control of the image, then you do not control its location. And if the location changes, the browser will not be able to fetch it and the image will just disappear from your site. So I recommend using images located within the project's files. So I'll go back again to Wikipedia, and this time when I right click, I will select the option to save it. And I will save it as google-logo.png in an images folder that's inside the same folder where my HTML file is located. Next, we're going to take note of the file type, as we need to know the whole file name for it to work in HTML. This particular image is a PNG file, but you could also have file types like JPEGs or GIFs, for example. So just like we do with the image from the online source, we're just going to enter the path to the image into our source attribute. Our file is nested inside of a folder called images, so we need to reference this. So what we put into the src is the name of the folder, images, / Google google-logo.png. We're saying to the browser here that there's no HTTP, so look in the files for this image. Its location is in a folder called images, and the file name is google-logo.png. Now if we save, we see our image render to the screen. You can see that our image is probably a little bit too big for the page as it's rendered in full size. So we would likely want to customize the size of the image so that it is going to display better and is a much more reasonable size on our screen. Normally we would do this with CSS, but as we're not using CSS at the moment, we can use some HTML attributes to do this. Before we get onto this, one thing Chrome allows us to do is look at what's under the hood of any website using tools that are directly built into the browser. Chrome calls these features dev tools. We don't need to worry a huge amount at the moment about dev tools other than knowing that we can inspect websites and look at the HTML that any given website is using. We do this by right-clicking on the image here and selecting Inspect. We now see that the image is highlighted with a box and it tells us that it is an image element. I want to make this much smaller than it currently is, so I think I'll make this probably about 250 pixels by 85 pixels, and I'll do this using, as I say, some HTML attributes. So returning to the MDN Attributes reference, we have an attribute called height and another one called width. And we'll add these attributes to our image element, just remembering to leave a space between the attributes that are currently there. It doesn't matter in which order we put these in the opening tag, it just matters that they're there. So I'll just add them after the attribute that we currently have in place. So we'll put width 250 pixels, and we'll also add a height of 85 pixels. We see now that the image scales down to a much more manageable size, and that should suit our purposes. If you've been using Emmet to make images and you didn't handwrite it like I did earlier, you may notice that you have a image element built that has an src attribute, and you also have this other attribute which is called the alt attribute. And this alt attribute is actually really important, and we should always include it with all of our image elements. It is used first to specify some alternative text to use when, say, for whatever reason our image cannot load on the page. Perhaps there's a slow connection or an error we ourselves have made in entering the image's source location. Secondly, it provides a description to images which can be read by search engines, so it's good for SEO, but it has a much more important function, and this is that it is important for accessibility. The alt attribute is used by screen reader software, so that a person who is listening to the content of a web page, for instance somebody that might be impaired visually, can still interact with the image. There's a great article here on the WebAIM site which explains this a lot better than I can do justice, and I do encourage you to read this and understand it. WebAIM is an organisation that I believe is located at Utah State University, and they do some great work in providing web accessibility products and services. They have a really cool tool called the Web Accessibility Evaluation Tool, or WAVE, which allows you to check how accessible any given website is. I've checked it against the BBC website just before filming this video, and I will drop the link to it in the description and encourage you to check your own work using this tool. So in light of all of this, I'll delete the image element and I'll give the image that we're actually working with an alt attribute. I'll give it the value of the Google logo, which is perfectly descriptive of what this image represents. So if I just mess up the path to the src so the image doesn't display, we'll now see that the alt or alternative text is instead displayed where the image could not. Okay, so we'll move on to the next task here, and that is that we currently have two elements on the page, a link and a picture, but why have two when just one will do the job? I want to be able to link to Google, but I want this image to be the link. How can we remove the text and insert the Google logo into the link instead? Well, I'd like you to pause the video here if you can and give that a quick go. And once you're finished, come back and I'll show you how to do it. Okay, so I hope you got on okay with that. Doing this is actually quite simple. All we need to do is go to our link and take out the text. Then we cut out our image element using Control or Command and X. go back to the link and we will just simply put this where the text was. It's that simple. So here we have an anchor element that goes to Google via an href, and the image is now the visible and clickable part of the link. So if we save, we have our Google logo that is now our link to google.com as well. And I'll test that out, and that seems to be working just fine. We also see that we've got a decent amount of attributes in use as well for this one image that is a link. So that's how we link to pages on other websites, and these are known as absolute links or the absolute path. However, we don't just link to external locations. Most commonly, we'll link to pages within our own sites, and these work ever so slightly differently, and these are called relative links or the relative path. These do not need an HTTP protocol like absolute links. So to demonstrate the relative path, I'm going to link to a new page which I'm going to create called about.html. So let's imagine that this is going to be an about page for our imaginary website. So I'll go to the Explorer here in VS Code and add a new file by clicking just here, and I'll call it about.html. Next, I'm going to use an exclamation mark and hit tab to build out the HTML structure of our about page. And in the body, I'll give it an H1 with the text of about. Next, just below the H1, I'm going to give it an anchor element with the href set to index.html. So I'll give it some clickable text of something like back home. Again, I do not need to put in an HTTP. I just need to put the name of the file that I'm linking to as it is in the same folder as the location as the page that we're currently working with. Remember that without the HTTP, the browser is just going to look in the root folder or directory for the page, and here it will find it. So I'll go back to the index.html file now, and I'll add a link to our new about page. I'll use emmet to make an A element, and I'll give it an href of about.html. I'll give it some clickable text of about page, and now when I click this, it will take me to that page, and we can click back and forth between the two pages. If you keep an eye on the URL at the top of the browser, you can see that it changes when we click between the pages. It's the same folder and location, but has linked to a new page in that location. So we looked at the absolute path and the relative path, and now the last thing we'll look at before we move on is links that are within a single page, or we would call these anchor links. So stick with me for 1 second. To demonstrate this, I'm actually going to need to add some more content to my page. So we have a relatively long page that will be able to scroll essentially. I'll add a paragraph element above our image, and I'll give it 50 words of lorem ipsum. And above that, I'll add an H2 and give the H2 the text of 1. Now I'll highlight all of this, including the image, and duplicate it 4 more times. I'll replace the text in the H2 in the duplicated sections with the words 2, 3, 4, and finally 5. And when you see pages like this which are really, really long, it's quite commonplace these days, given the current trend for single page sites, then you might see a clickable element or link which takes you back to the top of the page. This is simply an anchor link or an internal link on a page, and these are really simple to create in HTML, and we do this using what is known as IDs. So I'm going to take the first H2 tag in our body section, which kicks off the content of the page, and I'm going to give this an ID of top. So we put ID as the attribute name, and then the value is top. We're going to be using IDs a fair amount in CSS and JavaScript. The ID attribute specifies a unique ID or identifier for an HTML element. The value must be unique within the HTML document. So this means the ID value can be used by CSS and JavaScript to target a particular element and do something with it. IDs can be used on any elements, but each ID has to be unique, and each ID can only be used once per page. So this ID of top that we just gave our H2 cannot be used again on the page. Okay, so now that we have defined the top of our page, we can add a link at the bottom of our code here that will bring us back to the top. For internal links, we use a hash or octothorpe followed by the value of the ID where we want to return to. In this case, we want to return to the top. So I will put hash or octothorpe and then top. And now we'll enter in some text, and you can also use other things such as images, as we said before, but here I'm just going to type back to the top. So once we save and click on that, we see that it takes us back to the top of the page using a link within a page known as an anchor link. Let's say that we wanted to jump from the top to the bottom image on the page. Do you think that you could add a link, say at the top of the page, that will take us all the way down to the bottom image? So if you think you can do that, pause and give it a go. If not, I'm going to show you how to do that right now. So here is how I would do that. Very similar to the method that we use to go back to the top. I will go to the code for the very bottom image, and I'm going to give it an ID. And the value of the ID is going to be bottom. Next, I'll head back to the top of the page and create the link that is going to take us there. So under H1, I'll use emit to create an A element, and I will give it the href of bottom. And the text that I want to click will say go to the bottom. Okay, so I'll save that. We have our link, and when we click it, it works perfectly and jumps straight to the bottom image. We can now click the link at the bottom to jump back to the top, and we can keep going back and forth. We can click our images to open external links to Google, and we can go to our About page by clicking the link to go to that. Then of course we can return back to our own home page from the About page. So this has been a really long video on links, images and attributes, and I purposefully wanted to put something in that was a little longer with multiple concepts to push you a little bit. So well done for sticking with it. You've come a really long way already with plenty of exciting material still to come. So to sum up, we've got three types of links. We've looked at absolute links, which take us to a specific external site or page, which we define in the href using the HTTP protocol. We've got relative links, which will take us to another page within our site. The locations are relative to one another and exist within the same folder or directory. They are linked by the A tags. And then we have anchor links, and anchor links take you to another part of the page that you're currently on. So in this video, we've looked at HTML attributes, specifically with reference to links and images. We've seen how we can add links using the A tag and images with the image tag. We then looked at attributes and how we can add these to HTML elements. For our links, the attributes were the href or the hyperlink reference, and for our images, it was the source. These attributes provide additional information like the location of an image or the URL that we want to link to. We then added additional attributes to give more information to the browser about our elements, and we also added a couple of IDs that have enabled us to traverse between locations on the same page. We'll be using attributes all the time with our HTML elements, and you might want to keep looking over the MDN Attribute reference for more information and bookmark it as I've recommended. Again, you don't need to memorize all of these, and you will only regularly use 10 to 15 attributes. Next, I'll give you guys a little bit of a bonus for sticking with the video this far. At the beginning of the HTML videos, I spoke about the front-end triad. These are three technologies that work in conjunction with one another: HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. So I'm going to give you the first example of some of these technologies working in conjunction with each other, and I'm going to give you some JavaScript to handle the internal scrolling between our anchor links. Obviously, as this is an HTML section and a video covering HTML, I'm not expecting you to understand what the JavaScript does, but I'll explain it as simply as possible. So what this does is it selects all A tags with an href attribute that starts with a hash or octothorpe. We're then saying that for each of these anchor elements, we're going to listen for a click on them. When there is, we're going to execute a function that will scroll into view the element's href. Normally we would put our JavaScript in a separate file and link that JavaScript file to our HTML. but for now we can just use this JavaScript directly in our HTML file. How we do that is we add a script element at the bottom of our body and we give it an attribute again of type. But this time the value is text/JavaScript. Then our code just goes in there, and it's as simple as that. Now, if we save, we see that when we click, we have this nice scrolling effect between the internal links on our page. Okay, so we'll stop here. We've seen a decent amount of attributes associated with links and images, including the href and source attributes, height and width and alt attributes for images, and target attributes for links. We've also looked at dead links, linking to external pages out on the web, linking to other pages within our own site, and linking to other sections of a given page of our website. Finally, we had a quick bonus look at a little bit of JavaScript where we target elements that have hrefs, which start with a hash symbol, and we then use those to scroll when clicked. I just wanted to expose you to something else to whet your appetite for what is yet to come. I hope you enjoyed this and found it useful. Just with what you know already from these first few videos, you can start building unstyled multi-page websites that include headings, paragraphs, images and links that will enable you to traverse between the multiple pages of your site and also between different sections of each page. In the next video, we'll look at the target attribute in more detail before we move on to HTML entities and HTML tables. Remember to smash that like button, subscribe, comment, hurl abuse or whatever you like, as it really helps with YouTube's algorithm. But thank you very much for watching, thanks for your time, and I'll see you in the next video.